People come in.
Mhm.
Hi, welcome everybody. Um, my name is Tammy Gaskell, and I'm the director of the Roloff Jansen Community Library and also the chair of the Columbia County Libraries Association. And I'm joined tonight by Thea Scoop from the Claverack Library and the vice chair of the County Library Association. We'll be monitoring the chat and the Q&A. But most importantly, I'm joined by Jeff Urbin. So Jeff is an educator at the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum. We've had him present to our organization several times before. Always been a great pleasure, and I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say tonight in this program on the Roosevelts, race, and civil rights. So I will turn it over to Jeff. Please, if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A. And also, if you have more than one person who's viewing with you, if there's a couple of you, could you put that in the chat so that we can get a more accurate account of how many people are attending? Thanks, and take it away, Jeff.
Great. Thank you so much. Hey, everybody. I'm delighted to be here with you. I have a little bit of a froggy voice. I had the flu like 2 weeks ago, and it's kind of just been lingering on. So please bear with me. But I'm delighted to be here tonight to talk about the Roosevelts, race, and civil rights, which is based upon a exhibit that we have currently at the Presidential Library and Museum in Hyde Park. It has been up for almost 2 years now, and it comes down at the end of this month. So if you have not had a chance to come down and see it, you got to make plans to do that because February 28th, it closes, and that will be your last opportunity to have seen this really important um, uh, exhibit, and one on a very important topic, and one that includes a lot of history packed into a small space. So tonight, what I'm going to do is talk to you a little bit about that exhibit and kind of walk you through the progression of how things went in terms of the Roosevelts and race and civil rights in their time period. Most folks associate civil rights with the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, with the marches and the boycotts and those very important events during that period. But much of that can be traced back another 10 or 15 years to the Roosevelt administration, and that's really what this exhibit was designed to show. So, without further ado, let's get started. Now, Martin Luther King once said that the arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice, and that's exactly what this exhibit does, and that's exactly what the Roosevelt record with in terms of race and civil rights does as well. It is a long arc bending toward justice. There are some stops along the way. There are some setbacks along the way. And there are quite a few areas where progress was made along the way. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So let's start after the American Civil War. The American Civil War, of course, 1860 to 1865 ends, and African Americans are now free people, and they can vote based upon the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And as the war comes to a close and the former enslaved people find themselves free or more free and able to do what it is that they want to do, they generally tended to coalesce around the Republican Party. And the reason for that, of course, was Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, and he was the one who led the war to end slavery. And so it made logical sense that many of the African Americans at that time, the formerly enslaved folks, would become Republicans. But after the Civil War, the Jim Crow era came in. And Jim Crow was actually a character in a minstrel program. And it came to be the title for that whole series of laws, attitudes, events during this period that kept African Americans from fully participating, in their communities and in their societies. And Jim Crow was something that many people associate with the South, and it certainly was more deeply ingrained in the South and more dramatically encouraged and enforced in the South. But it is an attitude that permeated the entire United States. There was Jim Crow in the North as well, but to a lesser degree and to a lesser extent. So when I'm talking about, Jim Crow, I'm talking about, this sort of thing, right? Where here's a theater that is for colored people, not for the general public. So you want to see a film, all right, you're going to have to go to a separate movie theater to do that. If you're thirsty, then you're going to have to drink from the colored only water fountain there as well, especially in the South. But in the North, there were some of these attitudes as well, and because they were less enforced, they were less ingrained. Many of the African Americans from the South began to move into the North and into the northern cities. The Roosevelt family was, as you probably know, here in the Hudson Valley. They were a wealthy family, and they were sort of tied up in their own activities and things, and they really weren't that aware of what was going on with African Americans in the country. And I don't mean to say that as an excuse. They could have been, they should have been, but they were in a world of their own, a world of wealth, a world of privilege. And most of the African Americans that they came in contact with seemed to be doing pretty well, right? Because they were working for these rich families and were being relatively well taken care of, in terms of housing and, wages and those sorts of things. So this is a typical family picture of the Roosevelts. You have Eleanor and Franklin there, and this is Franklin's mom over here, and these are the various Roosevelt children. So I think you can see that this is not your average American family for the time frame and during the time that we're talking about here. So a term that you might want to use for the Roosevelts was kind of a benevolent neglect. They weren't really aware of what was going on. They didn't really concern themselves with what was going on for the African American community in the United States. That is until President Roosevelt decided to run for the presidency. And in 1932, he began to lay his, well, actually, even before that, he began to lay his foundation for running for president. And he saw African Americans as an important voting bloc. As I said, they began to move from the South into the North, and that was beginning to change some of the political dynamics here in the North. And Roosevelt pledged himself to a New Deal for himself and for the American people. Now, many African Americans had not gotten much benefit from the 20 or 30 or 40 years of Republican rule, especially with Jim Crow and such. And so when Roosevelt came along and pledged this idea of a New Deal, many African Americans wondered if that meant a New Deal for them as well. And there was a gentleman by the name of Robert Vann, and here he is here. And Robert Vann was a member of the Black Press. The Black Press was a series of newspapers all across the country. and they were run by African Americans, and they were written in large measure by African Americans for African Americans. So the mainstream press wasn't always covering what was going on in Black communities. They just didn't feel it was important. So the Black press said, well, we do, and we're going to cover this stuff. And so they began to cover their own communities and such. And Robert Vann took President Roosevelt at his word. And he said, why don't we give this guy a shot? We haven't gotten a whole lot from the Republicans, and this guy's promising a New Deal. Let's see what he has to offer. The debt to Abraham Lincoln has been well paid back. Let's turn that picture to the wall and let's give Roosevelt a chance. Let's give Roosevelt a shot. And so what you had in the 1932 election, and then again in the 34 midterm elections and the 1936 elections, was a movement of African American voters beginning to vote more and more for the Democratic Party, especially the Roosevelt Party. So here's a political cartoon that says it's a New Deal, and this is basically showing what the New Deal is going to try to bring about. And you've got the cards here laid out: a bank holiday, protection for gold, right? You're going to have a budget message, an inaugural address, and bank legislation. And this is what the New Deal is for Americans. African Americans had a slightly different perspective. They expected a New Deal, but this is what they saw coming out. And this is, you can see here on the cuff, the Negro and the Roosevelt administration talking about a different kind of New Deal. They were expecting a man's chance to earn a living, full political recognition, equality, and justice. And this is not quite what they were getting out of the New Deal. So the early New Deal programs, which were designed to help bring about improved conditions for everybody in the country, actually and inadvertently had a negative impact on many Black Americans. So here these voters are thinking, hey, this guy, let's give him a shot, give him a chance. They give him a chance, he gets in there, and some of the programs that he begins to put forth are actually not helpful to Black communities. One of those is the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA. And this was an idea to pay farmers not to produce their entire acreage, so that, let's say you have 500 acres, rather than bring 500 acres worth of strawberries to the market and drive the price down, let's only bring 200 acres of strawberries to the market, and that will help sustain a higher price. Well, the problem with the Agricultural Adjustment Act was that the money not to plant these fields was going to the farm owners, who generally tended to be white. And so now, if they are taking their fields out of production, what that means is they are laying off huge numbers of African Americans, who are the folks who are generally tending to work this land and such. So what it did was it created a huge unemployment problem for particularly African Americans. It was unintended. It was not what they were looking for. But nonetheless, the white farm owners took the money, laid off the Black farm workers, and it created a major problem for those folks there as well. There were also attempts to bring about better loans for mortgages for folks across the country. And this was, again, had an unintended consequence. This is a map of Poughkeepsie, New York. Right, you're all familiar with Poughkeepsie down here, and you can see where the Hudson River is over here along the bottom. And what happened is they began to create these boards that would give loans to people to buy homes. But what they did was they began to literally redline around certain areas and certain locations. So what this meant was that if you were an African American, you were not likely to get a loan to buy a house in a predominantly white neighborhood. You were sort of, okay, well, here you can get jobs down, or you can get loans down here, you can get loans up here, but you're not going to get loans in the rest of these areas. And what this did was create a sense of de facto segregation. All right, it wasn't designed to do that, but that was the ultimate effect. And so what this did was it tended to have African Americans getting loans in traditionally African American areas, and thereby segregating them out from the rest of the population. Now, this had a huge, huge impact. And this went on in cities all across the country. This happens to be a map of Poughkeepsie because we wanted to show very close. Many of our visitors come from the Hudson Valley here or New York State. They're familiar with Poughkeepsie. Well, we wanted to show, hey, here's a city you've heard of, you've been to, you've been through, and here's how this thing impacted folks. And the big problem with this is that what this did was it helped to create generational poverty, because what it meant was that the African Americans tended to generally be in poorer neighborhoods, and the white citizens generally tended to be in the more affluent neighborhoods. And as we all know, right, owning a home is a wonderful way to build wealth, right? So you start off when you're brand new, you get a little house, a little shack. You're so happy to have it. Woo, I finally got my own place. And then after a couple of years, you start a family, you sell that place, you trade up, and you continually trade up until the point where you don't need a big house anymore, and then you begin to downsize and trade down. And that's how we build wealth from generation to generation. However, that's not going to work if you can't get on the track to do that. If you can't get a loan, or if you get a loan in an area where the housing rates are so low that even if you do sell it, you're not really making anything, you're not really building any of that equity, then what you've done now is you've created a generational pattern that lasted from the 1930s all the way in to the 1970s as well. So this began to be pointed out to FDR, it began to be pointed out to the administration, and they began to make changes about this, right? These were unintended consequences, but nonetheless, they were consequences. And so they began to try to work better deals and work ways around some of these problems. Now, the problem was that in order for these programs to be passed, they had to be passed through the Congress. And the Congress was, this is not a very good chart, but this is a chart that shows the House and the Senate in the Southern committees. These are the Southern committees that are run and administered by strong Southern Democrats, white Southern Democrats, who tend to be somewhat racist in their ideas and their attitudes. And so in order for Roosevelt to pass anything through the Congress, he had to get it through these various committees. And these committees were committees such as the Judiciary Committee, the Agricultural Committee, Military Affairs, Ways and Means, Banking and Currency, Appropriations, the Rules Committee, Foreign Affairs, Naval Affairs, and Agriculture and Forestry. So these are all very important committees that were being controlled by very powerful white Southern Democrats. So what Roosevelt was able to do was to inch his way toward correcting these problems and solving these problems, but he couldn't go as far as he wanted to because he needed to keep those Southern Democrats happy, basically. He understood that if he were to really, piss these guys off, that they would then kill all the rest of his legislation. So the entire New Deal would go down the toilet if he were to alienate these folks. And so this very delicate balance began to occur and began to happen. Now, as early as 1934, Mrs. Roosevelt had caught on that something really needed to be done. Right. I said a minute ago that it was kind of benign neglect, but Mrs. Roosevelt got over that the first in the family. And part of this was because she traveled around the country on behalf of the president. She traveled 44,000 miles her first year as First Lady. And she visited people in all corners of the country, all walks of life, black and white, rural, city, you name it, she was out there. And she saw that these programs either were not working for African Americans or were working against African Americans. And so she would come back to the president and she would report back, well, here's what I saw, here's what's going on, here's how this is happening. And, she really was a great um, influencer, let's say, in, excuse me, helping to get the president to move in a more positive and uh, beneficial direction for African Americans. So you have these red line maps, you have this congressional control, you have this job discrimination in terms of being able to be hired into some of the new deals, and that resulted as a result of the fact that the decisions were allowed to be made locally. So the funding was coming from Washington, but the decisions were allowed to be made locally. And so what that meant was that if you had local folks who are not necessarily looking to help Black families or help Black workers, then they would tend to hire white workers. They would tend to hire white families. And so the actual implementation of this being left at the local level really had an impact on the ability for folks to sort of skirt what the intent of these these programs were. Now, one of the ways that FDR got around this was he appointed more African Americans to positions in the government than every other president to that point combined. So what this means is that he was bringing Black voices into the into the government. So in agriculture, in commerce, in banking, in the military, all these places across the government. And what this did was it gave a Black voice inside the government. So that now, rather than being completely oblivious, these agencies had somebody in there that could advocate for what it was that they were looking to do. And there was a woman by the name of Mary McLeod Bethune, and she happened to notice, hey, we've got more of us now in the government than ever before. And she likened it to this idea of having a finger, pointing at something or poking something. And yeah, that's kind of annoying, a finger, right? But if you take all your fingers and you bring them together and you really have them pushing in the same direction, now you've got some real impact. And so what she did was she went around to the various African American members in the government, and she said, we need to work together, right? Not your voice over here, my voice over here, and your voice there, and your voice there, but all of our voices combined to work together. And she organized what came to be called the Black Cabinet. And here is Mary Bethune right there. She was an educator, she was a social activist, she was an organizer, and she got all these guys together and began to push and move in the same direction. So rather than a call coming in here, a call coming in there, a call coming in there, they were able to work as a block and begin to move things along. So here's a picture of her with members of the Black Cabinet. It's interesting to note that she is the only woman in the group, right? The rest are African American men from various places within the government. And she has organized them and has got them now moving all in the same direction. Now, it doesn't hurt that she also happens to have a buddy pretty high up in government, and that is Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt is an activist. Eleanor Roosevelt is an educator. Mary Bethune is as well. And so these guys are friends. And what Mrs. Roosevelt does is she invites them to have a conference at the White House. Right? How better can we raise awareness? Let's meet at the White House and let's talk about what the administration needs to do and what the administration can do. Now, because the administration is beginning to make these efforts, right, of going back and looking at the Agricultural Adjustment Act, of going back and looking at these home loans, of going back and appointing more African American voices to government, to beginning to sort of listen to and respond to the Black cabinet, conditions do begin to get better. And the African American community says, hey, this guy is trying, right? We were a little bit nervous at first, but he really is trying and he really is making some advances. So as a result of that, Roosevelt picked up more African American votes in the 1934 midterm elections in the Congress, thereby helping to begin to chip away at this chart here. And again, in the 1936 campaign as well. Excuse me. So by 1936, what happens is that they're going to have a convention in Chicago, and for the very first time ever, African American delegates are part of the delegations in the conference and in the convention. Prior to that, there had never been an African American delegate in either the Republican national conventions or the Democratic national conventions. And in 1936, there were 10. Now that's a small, small number, right, compared to the hundreds that are there, but it's 10 more than has ever been there before. And not only were some of these guys there as delegates, but they had important roles in the actual convention. So this gentleman down here is Marshall Shepard, and he's from Philadelphia, and he is a reverend, and he is the one who gives the opening and closing prayer for the conventions. And this guy up here, Arthur Miller, is the only Black member of the House of Representatives, and he is from Illinois, and he is given a speaking role at the convention. He's actually able to get up and address the hundreds of other delegates at the convention. What happens as a result of this is many of the Southern delegations literally get up and walk out. Right? This is the beginning of the Dixiecrat movement. They're saying, look, this is no. This is too far. We can't have African Americans at the convention, and we certainly can't have them in leadership roles where they're actually giving speeches and addressing the entire crowd. So many of the Southern Democrats just get up and walk out. And Roosevelt says, let them go. Let them go. These are not the folks we want in the party. We will be able to pull this off with the growing support of African Americans and the growing understanding of white Americans as to the needs of African Americans. So 1936, the 1936 election was a huge turning point for African American voters in the United States. It was in 1936, the 1936 presidential election, that African American voters became a solid part of the New Deal constituency, and they remained there all the way on up through today. Now, because you are getting more and more support from African American communities and African American voters, and the tide is beginning to change a little bit in terms of attitudes and such, you are beginning to get changes in some of the New Deal programs. And two of them in particular were the Works Progress Administration, this one down here, and the National Youth Administration. And what the National Youth Administration did was it took young people, predominantly not African American young people, and it began to give them opportunities to express themselves and to gain skills and to begin to get some job skills. Once 36 occurs, African American students are allowed into the program. And with the WPA, prior to 36, the way this worked was the government would generally hire companies to do the big projects of the WPA, right? The Works Progress Administration. The dams, the buildings, the bridges, the roads, the highways, and those sorts of things. And what they did was they changed the legislation and said, if you want government funding for a project, then we are going to ask that you hire a certain number of African Americans for the job, right? We want to see African Americans on these payrolls as well. We're not saying you absolutely have to. If you don't want to, then you don't have to, but you're not going to be able to compete for the bid. And what this did was it opened up thousands of jobs, good paying jobs, hard good paying jobs to African Americans at that time as well. Now, round about this time, there is a major movement toward an anti-lynching bill, right? Lynching had been a problem in this country for a very long time. And when I say lynching, what I basically mean is taking people and hanging them simply because they're black, right? Maybe you would, accuse them of a crime and, have some veiled excuse to be able to do this. But this was something that went on all across the country. And there was a movement afoot to have a national anti-lynching bill. President Roosevelt would not support that. Mrs. Roosevelt did support it. And this is where you really see this divergence in their approach to what's going on. Mrs. Roosevelt thinks, yes, we do need a national anti-lynching bill, right? This is terrible. This cannot happen. And we need a national law against this. President Roosevelt agreed that it was terrible. President Roosevelt agreed that it shouldn't be happening, but he understood that if he supported an anti-lynching bill in the Congress for the national anti-lynching bill, that it would come up against the folks in these committees, and they would not only vote it down, but they would then turn on him and vote down, excuse me, the rest of the New Deal programs. President Roosevelt, his argument was that lynching is murder, and that every state in the country has laws against murder. And so if there's a lynching, it needs to be handled by the local authorities to look into it, to bring whoever did the lynching to justice, for the courts in those areas to work. And of course, this is a great idea and great in theory, but who are many of the people that are in those positions in these places that this lynching is occurring? Well, it tends to be people who are not sympathetic to the rights, lives, or livelihoods of African Americans. And so it really is kind of leaving the problem there in and of its own. But this was an opportunity for President Roosevelt to show some real leadership and say, hey, look, you know what? I don't care. This is the right thing to do. We're going to push for this. But he had a political calculation, which was, if I do this, everything else that I want to do can't be done. And so let's, chip away at this as we can and as we are able to do. So you have movements now going on in the National Youth Administration. You've got movements now going on in the WPA, and you've got a lot of awareness now that something needs to be done for African American communities. You also have Mrs. Roosevelt, who again, very close pals with Mary McLeod Bethune, and these two are working together to try to find ways to bring advances for folks as well. Then along comes 1939, and the war begins in Europe. So Adolf Hitler, excuse me, invades Poland in September of 1939, beginning the Second World War officially. Of course, he'd been up to dirty tricks well before that. And the United States tries to remain neutral. We try to stay out of it. We're not Hitler fans by any means, don't get me wrong, but there are laws on the books about helping belligerent nations, and there are laws on the books about neutrality, maintaining neutrality. After the First World War, the United States passed these laws to try to stay out of another conflict in Europe. But by 1939, 1940, what's going on with Hitler is seen as something that really needs to be addressed. And the president is looking for ways to do that without coming awry of those laws and such. And so what ends up happening is much of this goes out the window on December 7th, 1941, when Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, and now the United States is drawn into the war. We are now in the war with Japan. 3 days later, on December 11th, 1941, Hitler declares war on the United States, and now we are at war with Hitler there as well. And so there is massive mobilization, right? Everybody, that can go into uniform goes into uniform. If you can't go into uniform, you go and become a air raid warden or a scrap drive administrator. Women are asked to come out of the home and go into the factories to become Rosie the Riveters, building machinery and supplies and such for the folks that are fighting the war. And red-blooded Americans who happen to have dark skin also feel the urge and the need to defend their country. And so they begin to sign up for the Army and the military as well. However, there is a 1925 Army War College report, which was put out in November of 1925, that said as official policy that African Americans were not fit for combat, that they were fine in the military in jobs such as driving carpool, driving trucks around, and KP, cooking potatoes, peeling potatoes, those sorts of things. But they were not qualified for combat positions. They were not qualified for leadership positions. And of course, this is total bunk. Right. And so the African Americans want to sign up, but they want to really get in the fight. Right. They don't want to just, sign up to peel potatoes. They want to get in there and make things happen and begin to move forward. And so what this does is it creates a bit of a crisis in the country because who are we fighting? We're fighting Adolf Hitler. And who is Adolf Hitler? He's a racist. Right? He's a guy that believes that some people are superior to others simply by who they are in terms of, their race. And now we are saying to folks in this country, you can join the military, but you can't completely join it. You can't fully join it. You can only join it to go into these particular little areas. And of course, this does not set well with the African American communities. They want to participate fully and completely. So there's a 1940 election coming along, and President Roosevelt is beginning to see some slippage in support among Black voters. And so he needs to do something to shore up this support for the 1940 election. One of the things he does is he appoints Benjamin O. Davis to become the first African-American general. And so this gets a lot of coverage in the Black press and a lot of coverage in the Black community. And like, okay, hey, great, that's good, right? Like, now we're getting someplace. We're beginning to move along here. And President Roosevelt also puts aside some public money through an act of Congress that allows African-American pilots, folks that want to become pilots and happen to be African Americans, can now get federal money to pay for flight schools at civilian flight schools that will take them. Okay, so this is a small step forward, but it's a tricky step forward. So, okay, you're an African American, you want to learn how to fly. Well, we're not going to teach you in the Army Air Corps. It just doesn't work that way. But if you can go out and earn a pilot's license in a ordinary civilian, school, right? Once you acquire that license, then you can come and apply to be in the Army Air Corps. And the problem was, of course, many of these places were segregated, and so it was difficult for these guys to find these flight schools. But enough of them did, and enough of them took advantage of this, that about 1,500 of them were recruited for a special program called the Tuskegee Airmen. And these were African-American pilots who went and got their official training, got their certificates, and then came into the military. And in the military, in the Army Air Corps, the Tuskegee Airmen at the Tuskegee Airmen Institute in Alabama, they were allowed to train along with white pilots as well. However, they were not welcome. The Army and the War Department said the Army is not a sociological experiment. It's not a sociological laboratory. And President Roosevelt said, well, that ordinarily that's the case, but it is if your commander-in-chief says it is, and I'm your commander-in-chief, and I say it is. So what happened was these guys got down there. They were given the lousiest barracks. They were given the crappiest equipment. They were given red paint to paint their planes, which is not a big, it's not a color you want to fly into battle with, right? A big bright red plane. So they only painted the tail ends of their planes red, and they began to organize themselves because many of the white pilots and the white commanders didn't want anything to do with them, and they organized themselves and they began to really perform, and they performed really, really well. So well, in fact, that they began to get a lot of attention. And they won over many of the white officers and the white pilots begrudgingly, just with their skill and their determination and their ambition. There also happened to be a woman by the name of Eleanor Roosevelt, who took an interest in this experiment. And she happened to be down in the Alabama area. And she said, I'm not far from Tuskegee. I'm going to pop over and see how things are going over there. So she pops over to the base. She gets there, she sees, these guys have got like crappy equipment. These guys have got lousy, barracks and things. And she says, how's it going, you guys? How's everything working out here for you? And a guy by the name of Colonel Anderson, Chief Anderson, says, well, Mrs. Roosevelt, the best way for us to show you what we're doing is to take you for a flight. And so this is a picture of Eleanor Roosevelt right here, and Chief Anderson, who was the top African-American pilot at the Tuskegee training facility. She hops in the plane, they take off. Secret Service almost faints, right? Oh my God, we just let the First Lady of the United States fly around with an African-American pilot. The Army War College report of 1925 says these guys aren't smart enough to do anything except for peel potatoes and drive the motor pool. What are we doing? What's going to happen here? Well, nothing. 25 minutes later, the plane lands, and this picture is taken. And you can see Mrs. Roosevelt is absolutely delighted. And she gets out of that plane and she says, these fellows can fly just as well as anybody. And that was a huge boost for the Tuskegee Airmen program. Now, Mrs. Roosevelt knew what she was talking about. She happened to be close personal friends with none other than Amelia Earhart. And Amelia Earhart happened to be a pretty darn good pilot. So Mrs. Roosevelt knew what good piloting was, and she saw it there in these African-American pilots there as well. The Tuskegee Airmen go on to become a distinguished flying unit. They have about a 92% success rate. The legend is they never lost a plane. That's not true, but they had a 92% success rate, which was really, really good. And their job was to protect bombers that were flying around on bombing missions across the sea. Now, this was a good step forward, but it wasn't enough. And so, some of the civil rights leaders, like A. Philip Randolph and Walter White, were pushing for more inclusion of African Americans in the military. So they keep pushing for this, and they end up getting an audience with the president, basically, in the White House. So they come in, they're in the White House, they're in the Oval Office, and the president says, all right, what can I do for you guys? And they're like, well, you're not giving opportunities to African Americans. We've got segregated units. They want to fight. They want to fight and defend their country. So FDR kind of gives them a little bit of sort of the runaround. It's like, well, it's kind of integrated, right? Because if you have black units and you have white units and they're on a battlefield, they're going to get kind of shuffled around through the battle. And that's kind of integration, don't you think? And they're like, no, we don't think that's integration. That's certainly not integration. So Roosevelt said, well, all right, the there must be something we can do. So let me talk to my staff, let me talk to the cabinet, and I'll get back to you about what we can do. And another one of the proposals that Roosevelt puts forth is, how about we let these guys be like in the band, right? Like the Marine band and the Army band and the Army Air Corps band. How about we give them jobs doing that, right? And this again is not what these guys are looking for. So Roosevelt says, let me think more about it. We'll get back and we'll talk again later on. And a couple of weeks goes by, and a couple of months goes by, and these guys are waiting for the president to call back, and he never does. And so they say, all right, we have to take action. And so what they do is they organize a march on Washington, D.C. So they're going to have this big march on Washington, D.C., and they're going to go down there and they're going to get 100,000 people to march in this for equal opportunity for African Americans in the military. And President Roosevelt gets wind of this and he says, we can't have this. We can't have a march on Washington. You know, here we are in the Second World War, right? We're fighting a two-war front in Europe and in Asia. And this is a time for unity. This is a time for coming together. We can't be letting the newsreels show marches on Washington, D.C., and have this non-compliance and this non-unity going on in this important time of war. So he sends Eleanor Roosevelt up to New York. Franklin Roosevelt says, listen, you know these guys, you got to get up there and you got to talk them out of it, right? So Mrs. Roosevelt goes to New York and she meets with A. Philip Randolph and she meets with Walter White and she says, listen, you guys, the president wants you to call off this march in Washington. And they say, well, Mrs. Roosevelt, we can't. And she says, oh, okay, I tried. I tried to talk you out of it, but you wouldn't listen to me. So she goes back to Washington and she says, Franklin, they are determined. This is going to happen. You know, there's nothing we can do to stop this. And so Roosevelt has to do some quick thinking. Now, of course, Mrs. Roosevelt was a very sympathetic person to send to these guys to try to get them to stop, but she was sympathetic for their cause. And so she didn't, the minute they said no, she's like, okay, well, I did everything I could possibly do. And she comes back and says, no, they're going to have this march. So Roosevelt has to do something, and he has to do something fast. Excuse me. So what he does is he issues an executive order. Let me see if I have it here. Let's see. Oh, here, I'm sorry, I should have shown you this. This is a picture of lynchings in 1943 in the United States, right? Heavily located in the South, but not isolated to the South, right? Other places there as well. So President Roosevelt says, all right, we got to do something. Let's do something. We'll get this worked out. We'll do something to make these guys happy. And what he does is he issues an executive order, which I can't find my copy of right now, but it's Executive Order 8802. And Executive Order 8802 is a very important executive order because what it does is it desegregates the defense industries. Okay, so what this says is, hey, African Americans, look, we're not going to integrate you guys into the military, right? But here's what we'll do. We'll desegregate the defense industries. And this was an important step forward because what this did was at this point, 1940, 1941, 90% of the industry is for defense, right? Making bullets and planes and tanks and Band-Aids and all that sort of stuff. And African Americans had been kept out of these jobs. Now we're going to integrate. So you guys, you want a job in the defense industries? Go apply. We'll have you come in there. So what this does is it opens up literally millions of jobs to African Americans to participate in the development of the war material for the war. Right now, you're making a real contribution. But not only that, these tended to be higher paying jobs because they were in the defense industry. So the ability for African Americans to have some earning power, quadrupled from what it was that they were going to be able to get, just in ordinary jobs. And these jobs had a great deal of expertise and training involved in them. So these aren't just like, putting widgets on something kind of a thing. These were jobs where you were learning skills that would then be able to be used in other industries and other places down the line. Now, what happened was President Roosevelt issues this executive order, and Philip Randall says, "All right, that's pretty good. We will postpone the march on Washington." Right? He's not canceling it; he's postponing it. Right? That's good. This is a good step forward. This is what we're looking for. So we'll call off the march temporarily. And that summer, across the country, there was violence. So here are riots going on. African Americans, when they applied for these jobs, were beaten up. They were told to hit the road. Um, there were riots, and this went on all summer. Mrs. Roosevelt spoke out against it. President Roosevelt kept mum about it. He wanted to just let the executive order hang there and say, look, that's what I did. I gave you the executive order, and this just has to work itself through. Again, an opportunity to show some leadership. He could have said, hey, listen, this is wrong. This is not what we're doing here. Let these guys in. But he chose to remain silent about it. By the end of the summer, these riots died down, and there was acceptance of Black workers in the factories across the country there as well. So the Second World War helped to advance civil rights for African Americans in the sense that it allowed them into the Tuskegee Airmen program, and also allowed them into the defense industries. And Executive Order 8802 was a huge step forward in that direction, and it was a stepping stone by which President Harry Truman was then able to completely desegregate the military when he became president. And he did that, I believe, in 1947. Okay, 2 years after the war. So that was a stepping stone. That was sort of a little bit of a leap, for then Truman to go the rest of the way. So Roosevelt had sort of laid that foundation there as well. And then, of course, President Roosevelt dies in April of 1945. We're on the cusp of winning the war, and we are having real progress across the board. And much of that progress is coming because of the impact and the work of African Americans in the defense industries and in some of these, military units. And so what ends up happening is the President Roosevelt passes away, and Mrs. Roosevelt continues on as an advocate for African Americans in the government. She stays around, and she pushes President Truman to continue the movement toward more rights and more opportunity for African Americans. She joins the NAACP board. She joins the actual board. She had been a member, but now she's a board member. And she is, really talking the talk and walking the walk for African American activism in the 40s and the 50s. She befriends a young Martin Luther King, who Jr., who then, of course, becomes Martin Luther King, the great civil rights activist that we all know, and she really becomes a force in the Democratic Party for maintaining and making sure that there's not slippage, or not a lot of slippage, in terms of what Democrats are doing for African Americans. And this continues on up through her death in 1962. Now, she gets into a little bit of a fracas there with the NAACP, because they are wanting her to be even more active than they're than she's being. But she begins to see the Cold War as taking over more and more attention as to what's going on in the world, and of course, the atomic standoff and such is very important. And she begins to see this as a more prominent danger to all of mankind than racism necessarily in the United States. She doesn't turn her back on it. She doesn't abandon it, but she begins to focus more on the human rights aspect of things with the United Nations there as well. And so what you see is throughout the course of this Roosevelt administration, they go from benign neglect to desegregating the defense industries. President Roosevelt does not come out in favor of an anti-lynching bill. Mrs. Roosevelt does, which puts a lot of pressure on some people in Washington. They see that some of these New Deal programs are not working in favor of African Americans. They begin to tweak and adjust them. They begin to bring more African American voices into government, where they then begin to organize themselves into what's called the Black Cabinet. So they're able to push more pressure on certain areas within the government. The government responds to that. By 1936, African Americans are strongly in the coalition of the New Deal. And at the 1936 convention, we have 10 African American delegates. Not a huge number, but 10 more than had ever been there before. And then the war comes along, and there is pressure to include more African Americans. It's sort of this back and forth here. The president doesn't make a very good faith effort, really. Oh yeah, you can be in the band if you want. That's really not what they're talking about. That's really not what they're working for. And so when they begin to organize this march and say, hey, we're going to hold your feet to the fire on this, right? This is serious stuff. You said you get back to us, and you didn't. But this is serious stuff. And when he didn't get back to them, they put the pressure on, and then he said, okay, all right, you guys, I get it. You're serious. And so he makes this effort to desegregate the military industries there as well. And so many of these things that you see later on in the civil rights movement, right? These idea of marches, these idea of boycotts, these idea of including, more voices and actually began in small steps in the Roosevelt administration. So that's what the exhibit is designed to show, that the movement toward more racial integration and equality really began when African Americans decided that they were wanting to be a part of the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party responded to that by answering needs of the Black community. And then it became kind of a sort of a perpetual motion machine there as well. The problem is, of course, that it's easy to make slippage, right? It's easy to fall back. It's easy to forget that the rights, the advances, the privileges that many folks have today came at the expense of other folks beforehand, and it is easy to become complacent about that. And so, I think it's important that we remember that, and then take whatever actions we feel we can take or need to take in order to address that situation as well. Excuse me. Now, Joanne says in the chat, one of the last decorated Tuskegee Airmen just passed away at 100. Right. Harry Stewart Jr., just over the weekend, I think it was. I think it might have been Friday or Saturday. I think he was 102, and he was one of the original African-American pilots of the Tuskegee Airmen. So, we're beginning to lose people from that generation, right? That generation is beginning to pass, and the lessons, the examples that they left for us need to be taken up, examined, and put to good use. Any questions, comments, snide remarks?
So Jeff, following up on that, Jean asks if you could address the Tuskegee syphilis study.
Ah, that was an entirely different Tuskegee experiment. That was done, I believe, through I forget exactly what agency it was. I think it was like Health and Human Services, something like that. So that's a completely different story than what the Tuskegee Airmen is. And of course, I don't know that much about that. I haven't studied that, but basically, it was an opportunity to well, I didn't say opportunity, but it was a situation where these subjects in this experimentation were not made aware of what it was that they were doing or having done to them, and it was basically using them as kind of guinea pigs, as it were. But that's not what we're talking about with this. This is we're talking about the Tuskegee Airmen. Let's see. Mrs. Roosevelt was a great advocate for the Black community. Mrs. Roosevelt was a great advocate for a lot of people and a great role model for all of us in terms of, she once said, it's better to light a candle than curse the darkness. So, certainly somebody that got it, as we say, well, I get it, right? She got it as early as 1934 and began to move that way. All right, anybody else? Mhm. And I don't mean to diminish that other Tuskegee experiment. I just don't know that much about it to say that anything really intelligently about it, other than it was done, I think, through Health and Human Services or one of those. Blah blah blah. Oh, Karen says da, 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 do. Oh, thank you. Hey, she's saying nice things about me, but here's the deal, right? It's because of the Roosevelt Presidential Library, right? So if you are enjoying these discussions, if you're enjoying these conversations, then please come down and visit us. And if you want to see this exhibit, right? If you want to see this exhibit, you got to make plans to do it between now and February, excuse me, 28th, because that's when the lights go down and the exhibit begins to be dismantled and taken apart. Parts of it will be integrated into our permanent exhibits, but to see this as a complete exhibit is really something that I think you would want to lend yourself to if you are able to do that in the next um, 18 days or so.
And let me just put a plug in for the fact that the Columbia County Libraries also have museum passes to the museum there, so you can check those out at the library or online.
Absolutely.
There's a
Absolutely.
couple other questions. Somebody asked, before the 1940s, were schools for Black children in Alabama and Mississippi strong enough that Blacks could be pilots?
Well, a lot of these folks didn't really go to school so much. They had to work, right? They had to work to put food on the table and such. And a lot of the folks that learned how to fly, both black and white pilots, um, a lot of the early folks just learned by trial and error. Like we have here in Dutchess County, the Rhinebeck Aerodrome, right? So you'd go and there were planes there. You'd hang out, and somebody would say, "Well, here, let me show you how you do this." And you would begin to learn those skills. Just like you could learn to drive a car without necessarily going to a driver's ed course or those sorts of things. So. A lot of these folks knew how to fly, but they just didn't have the credential. And so this was an opportunity for them to go and get the credential. And of course, I say opportunity, it was also a bit of a barrier, right? So yeah, we know you can fly, but until you have that piece of paper, we're not letting you anywhere near the military base here. So it's another kind of hurdle that they have to go over. But they showed that they could do it, and they did do it, and now they had the certification for that as well. So the schools in the country were not especially good for anybody, really. I mean, there were good schools. Some of the schools were very well run, and kids learned a lot. But a lot of kids were skipping school or getting out of school to going and working to help support their families and such. It really isn't until later on that we really understand. Okay, you know what? We got to get the kids out of the factories into the schools, get them this high school credential, and that will set them up for the ability then to go to college. And keep in mind that a lot of kids, unless you were from a wealthy family, didn't go to college, right? You got a high school diploma, and that was it. It was very rare for you to go to college. It wasn't really until after the war that huge numbers of folks who ordinarily wouldn't have gone to college began to go to college on the GI Bill, and that created a whole huge opportunity for these folks to get better jobs, and therefore make better income, and therefore have money to put their own kids through college, later on. So college phenomena in the United States is really pretty. It's really only in the last 80 years that it was open to everybody, or more people, I should say, than had been.
Yeah. Dinah notes that she learned recently that the Sears Roebuck fortune was used to improve public schools for Black Southern children.
Wow, that's great. Yeah, so there were folks out there that were doing, they were doing the right thing and helping folks out as best they could. But it was spotty, and even today, education is still very dependent upon your district, dependent upon budgeting, depending upon how they're able to attract teachers and such. So there's still some progress to be made.
Julie, do you want to ask your question? I've unmuted you.
Hi, Julie.
Julie? Maybe not. Okay. So I had a question, and that is at the end of the war,
Mm.
were Blacks forced out of jobs in the same way that women were when the men came back from the war? Did they lose ground there?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The old attitudes came back. Women were expected to walk off and go back and become Betty Crockers. In fact, a lot of there was an attempt made not to document a lot of what women were able to accomplish during the war, because they didn't want labor statistics showing how productive they could be, because that would give them ammunition to want to stay in jobs and such. So the idea was, okay, the guys are back, and so we're going to kind of go back to business as usual. Now, a lot of these guys, a lot of these African American guys had skills, and which they didn't have prior going into the war, and so that made them more competitive. But they were still up against the same old, racial prejudice in terms of hiring and such that had always existed. Especially the Tuskegee Airmen, many of them that tried to go into aviation after the war, civilian aviation, were taken into civilian aviation organizations, but weren't allowed anywhere near planes. So he's certainly piloting them. So okay, you want to work, we know you know a lot about planes, so you want to work inventory, you want to work, as a mechanic or whatever, that's fine. But I flew all these missions, I shot down all these enemy planes. Well, that's great, but that was then, this is now, so this is how it is.
So was that just some comments thanking you for the presentation, and somebody saying wasn't able to find the museum passes on our um, website. So we'll check into that and make sure that those are available.
Yeah, please do. That's a wonderful opportunity for folks to be able to come in and take a look. And we try to offer those with as few barriers and burdens as possible, because the stuff is there, and you need to come and look at it. You need to come and learn from it. So please make sure that you do. Okay.
Okay.
So my pleasure to be with you all. Sorry about the froggy voice, and we'll see you again in the not too distant future. In the meanwhile, keep supporting your local libraries.
And we will we will be having 3 more programs with Jeff this spring, one in March on Eleanor Roosevelt, and then in April on FDR and baseball, and then in May on FDR as a hobbyist. So we look forward to those, seeing Jeff then. So thank you, and thank you for everybody that came.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Good night.